The words echoed like thunder across a hushed kingdom. "Go to jail, traitor." It wasn't a phrase whispered in the tabloids or thrown around by anonymous online trolls. This was the kind of phrase that seemed to crawl out of history books, dragged straight from the bloody pages of royal betrayal, and now directed toward one man, Prince Harry. The youngest son of King Charles, the man once called the Spare, found himself staring at a reality so chilling that even centuries of royal scandals couldn't compare. Because this time, the enemy wasn't the media. It wasn't Parliament. It wasn't some faceless institution. It was his own father, the King of England, taking his son to court, accusing him of defamation, of treason not by sword but by words, and of dragging the monarchy's name through the mud in a way that could not be ignored. For Harry, it was more than shocking. It was a moment of sheer collapse, the ground beneath his feet giving way, his pale face reflecting the dawning truth. The crown itself was ready to bury him. But how did we get here? How did the once beloved young prince, the cheeky red-haired boy who walked behind his mother Diana's coffin and broke the world's heart, end up in this kind of showdown with his father? To understand, we have to rewind the clock, not just to the days of Meghan and Oprah, not just to the release of his memoir, but all the way back to the wounds that never healed. Because what we're about to uncover is not simply a legal case. It's the unraveling of a dynasty, the stripping of family bonds, and the haunting possibility that the son Diana protected with her life might be the very one destroyed by her absence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At the heart of this story lies a truth so devastating it reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. The bond between father and son, crushed under the weight of duty, betrayal, and public humiliation. Prince Harry's journey has always been about breaking free, escaping the rigid life that once suffocated him. But freedom has a price, and for Harry, that price may now be prison walls, or at the very least, total obliteration of what remains of his reputation. The man who wanted to build a new life in California, free from the monarchy, now finds himself staring down at a courtroom, his own father standing on the other side, demanding accountability. And the timing couldn't be more explosive. For years, whispers of betrayal circled like vultures around the House of Windsor. Harry's interviews with Oprah, his Netflix docuseries, his book filled with intimate family secrets. Each step pushed him further from his birthright and closer to exile. But what no one expected was King Charles, a man often described as cautious and slow to act, taking the nuclear option. Filing a defamation lawsuit against his own son isn't just unprecedented. It's catastrophic. It sends one message loud and clear: this is no longer a private feud. This is war. Imagine, for a moment, the surreal nature of this confrontation. The father, now king, whose crown rests heavy on his head, turning to centuries of legal power to silence his son. The son, once a soldier who fought in Afghanistan, now branded a traitor, facing the very real possibility of being dragged into a courtroom and having his words dissected piece by piece before the world. What could possibly drive a father to this? What could make Charles, a man who endured humiliation during the Diana years, who begged for public acceptance of Camilla, and who spent decades reshaping his image, risk it all by targeting Harry? The answer lies in the dangerous game Harry has been playing with truth and loyalty. Because words have power, and when those words attack the foundation of the monarchy, they become weapons sharper than any blade. The opening shots of this war were fired long before the lawsuit. They began with subtle digs in interviews, with Meghan's pointed comments about racism within the family, and with Harry's unrelenting need to expose what he saw as lies, manipulation, and cruelty within the royal system. Each revelation chipped away at the monarchy's carefully curated facade, each headline screaming of betrayal. And though Charles had remained silent for years, the silence ended the day he felt Harry crossed an invisible line. Defamation, a word that carries not only legal weight, but moral condemnation. In the king's eyes, Harry wasn't just speaking his truth anymore. He was spreading falsehoods that endangered the monarchy's survival. And survival, in the Windsor playbook, always comes before blood. The middle of this story is where the tension rises, where the kingdom begins to split into camps. One side sees Harry as the ultimate truth-teller, the rebel prince finally shining a light on the rot inside the palace walls. The other sees him as the Judas figure, cashing in on family pain, betraying a father who once held him as a child, and tarnishing the monarchy at its most vulnerable moment. And here lies the cruel twist. Both sides are right in some way. Because Harry's pain is real, his wounds are deep, and his struggle against the system that consumed his mother is undeniable. But so too are Charles's fears that his reign, already fragile, will be remembered not for stability, but for scandal. This lawsuit, then, is not just about money, not just about reputation. It is about drawing a line in the sand. Charles is telling the world, and perhaps his son most of all, that no one, not even a prince of his blood, can tear down the monarchy without consequences. And yet, beneath the legal jargon and the formalities of court documents, this is still a father and a son locked in a death grip of love and betrayal. Because for every headline calling Harry a traitor, there is still a father's memory of his little boy, laughing in the palace gardens, oblivious to the storm his future would bring. For every courtroom filing, there is still the ghost of Diana, watching from beyond, perhaps horrified at what her family has become. As the introduction closes, the tension coils tighter. We are left with the haunting image of Harry, pale and shaken, realizing the depth of the chasm between him and his father. This isn't just a fight for control of a narrative. This is survival. If Harry loses, he risks being cast forever as the traitor prince, the man who turned on his family and paid the price. If Charles loses, his reign may collapse under the weight of scandal, and history will record him not as a unifier, but as a king destroyed by his own child. The story that unfolds from here will not be gentle. It will be brutal, filled with courtroom revelations, family betrayals, and public reckonings. It will force us to ask questions no one ever thought possible. Can a king truly send his son to jail? Can a family torn apart by tragedy ever find peace? And most chilling of all, when loyalty to the crown collides with loyalty to blood, which one survives? That is where our story begins, and why you cannot look away. Because this is not just about Prince Harry or King Charles. It is about the collision of truth, power, and betrayal at the highest level of royalty. And as this battle unfolds, one thing is certain. The monarchy will never be the same again. It started quietly, almost too quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon before anyone notices the first crack of thunder. Prince Harry's breaking point wasn't a single outburst, a sudden declaration, or a single interview that lit the fuse. It was a slow erosion, years of pressure and pain that finally collapsed into something far more dangerous. To understand the lawsuit that shook the world, we have to step back to the roots of this bitter war between father and son, to the little moments and the growing resentments that hardened into something irreversible. For years, Harry played the role of the lovable spare. He was the cheeky one, the soldier, the young man who seemed to embody Diana's spirit of rebellion. But beneath the smiles, the jokes, and the tabloid headlines, Harry carried an invisible weight. He had grown up inside an institution where every smile was rehearsed, every mistake magnified, and every moment of vulnerability turned into public entertainment. When his mother died, that wound never healed, and instead of comfort, he was told to march behind her coffin for the cameras of the world. That day, something shifted in him. He became both the symbol of the monarchy's grief and its prisoner. The years that followed saw Harry struggle to find a place where he could be more than just the spare. But every time he stepped out of line, the machinery of the crown reminded him of his role. The military brought him a sense of belonging, a purpose beyond the palace walls. But even there, the press followed, his tours of duty overshadowed by headlines about his family, his romances, his mistakes. When Meghan entered his life, she wasn't just a partner. She was his escape hatch. She represented freedom, love without royal constraints, a chance to live as Harry the man, not Prince Harry the symbol. But with Meghan came a new storm. The British press tore into her from the start. Her race, her past, her supposed ambition, all became fodder for a media machine that thrived on scandal. Harry saw in Meghan the same cruelty that had consumed his mother. And so he fought back, first with silence, then with statements, then with actions. He and Meghan chose exile, retreating to California to build a new life. But leaving the palace didn't mean leaving the monarchy behind. If anything, the distance made the battle sharper. Interviews followed, And with each one, Harry's words became sharper too. When Harry sat with Oprah and accused unnamed royals of racism, it was more than a headline. It was a declaration of war. The monarchy thrives on silence, on never complaining and never explaining. Harry broke that rule, and in doing so, he broke the fragile trust with his family. Charles, newly ascended to the throne after decades of waiting, saw his reign overshadowed almost instantly by the accusations of his own son. And that was only the beginning. Then came Spare, Harry's memoir, a book that ripped open every wound and displayed it for the world to see. In its pages, he accused his brother William of physically attacking him, painted his stepmother Camilla as manipulative, and portrayed his father as distant and cold. To Harry, it was his truth. To Charles, it was a public execution. The king had endured humiliation before, during the Diana years, when his private life became a global scandal. But this was different. This wasn't the press inventing stories. It was his own son tearing apart the monarchy from within. The breaking point came when Harry's words were no longer seen as grievances, but as deliberate defamation. Advisors close to the king warned him that if Harry's accusations went unanswered, they would harden into truth in the public imagination. For centuries, the monarchy has survived not by being perfect, but by being untouchable. Harry's memoir stripped away that protection, leaving the monarchy exposed. Charles, cautious and deliberate, knew he couldn't ignore it forever. It wasn't just about family pride, it was about survival. The monarchy's power lies in perception. If the public believes the king is weak, manipulative, or corrupt, the institution begins to crumble. Harry's words weren't just personal, they were political. And so, in private meetings at Clarence House, Charles's advisors began to discuss the unthinkable. If Harry would not stop, they would have to make him stop. And the weapon they chose was the law. But even before the lawsuit, the signs of fracture were everywhere. William and Kate, once close to Harry, kept their distance. Camilla, who had spent decades trying to repair her reputation, seethed at being branded the villain once again. Courtiers whispered about betrayal, about the possibility that Harry had crossed a line no royal could ever return from. And Charles, caught between love for his son and duty to his crown, felt the walls closing in. The breaking point was reached when one particular set of comments, ones Charles's team insisted were outright lies, circulated worldwide. To them, this wasn't just painful, it was defamatory. The monarchy could endure scandal, but not slander. And so Charles made the decision that would shock the world. He would file a defamation lawsuit against his own son. The symbolism of this move cannot be overstated. A king suing his son is more than just legal action. It is the collapse of a family bond in the most public way possible. For Harry, it was a devastating blow, proof that his father no longer saw him as family, but as an enemy. For Charles, it was the only way to preserve the institution he had sacrificed his life to uphold. As this chapter closes, the storm has fully formed. The breaking point has been reached. Father and son are no longer bound by love, but divided by law. And the kingdom waits, breathless, for what comes next. The moment news broke that King Charles had filed a defamation lawsuit against his own son, the world froze. It wasn't the kind of scandal that people expected, not even in a monarchy that had endured abdications, divorces, affairs, and whispers of conspiracy. This was different. This was the King of England, a man tasked with embodying stability, dragging his youngest son into the legal battlefield. The headlines screamed with disbelief, the tabloids lit up with fury, and social media exploded in a frenzy of judgment. For many, it felt as though centuries of royal history had suddenly collided with modern brutality, producing an act so unprecedented that people struggled to comprehend it. Behind the headlines, though, the story was even darker. A defamation lawsuit is not filed lightly, least of all by a monarch. It represents not only a demand for justice, but also a declaration that someone has crossed a line that cannot be undone. In Harry's case, the accusations he made in interviews, his Netflix series, and most damningly in his memoir Spare, had been tolerated for as long as possible. But the words had shifted from painful recollections to statements that Charles's advisors insisted were outright falsehoods, crafted to destroy reputations and destabilize the monarchy itself. The legal document, drafted by some of the most powerful lawyers in Britain, was said to be a masterstroke of precision. It laid out instances where Harry accused Charles of neglect, emotional abandonment, and complicity in what Harry described as a toxic royal system that destroyed lives. But more damning were Harry's descriptions of Camilla, now queen consort, calling her dangerous, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice others to rehabilitate her own image was, in Charles's eyes, an unforgivable sin. This wasn't just an attack on a stepmother. It was an attack on the monarchy's carefully rebuilt facade. Camilla had fought for decades to gain acceptance, and Harry's words threatened to unravel it all. Charles knew that if those words were allowed to stand unchallenged, history would record them as truth. His reign, already fragile, would be defined by scandal rather than stability. So he acted. The lawsuit was filed quietly, but within hours, it leaked to the press. What followed was chaos. For Harry, the moment he heard the news was like ice water being poured over his head. Sources close to him claimed he turned pale, his voice faltering as he asked whether it was real. Meghan, furious, reportedly paced the room, demanding answers. Harry had always believed his father might disapprove, might even cut ties, but a lawsuit? That was a weapon he never imagined Charles would use. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a complete obliteration of what little remained of their bond. The legal world reacted immediately. Experts debated whether a king could even sue his own son without igniting a constitutional crisis. Some argued that Charles was setting a dangerous precedent, dragging the monarchy into the mud of personal vendettas. Others defended him, claiming that in an era of misinformation, no one, even a prince, was above accountability. Either way, the sheer symbolism of the lawsuit overshadowed everything else. It was no longer a family feud. It was a trial by fire, one that would decide not just reputations but the future of the monarchy itself. Within the walls of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was electric with both fear and resolve. Charles's senior advisors, some of whom had counseled him through the Diana years, whispered that this was the only path left. Silence had failed. Diplomacy had failed. Private appeals had failed. Harry would not stop, they argued, unless he was forced to. And so Charles gave his consent. The lawsuit was his line in the sand. But beyond the palace gates, the court of public opinion roared louder than any courtroom. People debated endlessly. Was Harry a truth-teller silenced by a powerful institution, or was he a reckless traitor who deserved the consequences of his actions? For some, Charles's decision was proof of strength, a king unwilling to allow lies to spread unchecked. For others, it was cruelty, a father turning his crown into a weapon against his own flesh and blood. What made the situation more volatile was the timing. Charles had only recently ascended the throne, and his reign was meant to be about stability and continuity. Instead, he found himself engulfed in a lawsuit that made the monarchy look fractured, vindictive, and fragile. His first great act as king wasn't one of unity, but of division. And Harry, far from silenced, now had the entire world watching him more closely than ever before. The lawsuit's contents quickly became the subject of leaks. Journalists claimed it cited specific passages in Spare that the palace insisted were defamatory. Among them were Harry's depiction of his father as emotionally absent, of Camilla as manipulative, and of the royal institution as complicit in Meghan's suffering. In legal terms, the case would come down to whether those statements were opinion or presented as fact, and whether they were damaging enough to merit defamation. But in symbolic terms, the case was about something far greater. It was about whether a prince could ever speak freely about his life without being destroyed for it. The early days after the filing were filled with speculation. Would the case actually make it to trial? Would Harry settle to avoid further humiliation? Would Charles relent under pressure from advisors who feared the monarchy's image being dragged into months, even years, of courtroom drama? No one knew. But what everyone did know was that the lawsuit had changed everything. From this point forward, the relationship between father and son was not just strained, it was adversarial. And in the middle of it all stood Meghan, accused by critics of fueling Harry's anger, of encouraging him to bare his soul to the world no matter the consequences. The palace saw her as an instigator, someone who pushed Harry further away from reconciliation and deeper into open war. Her defenders, meanwhile, argued that she was simply standing by her husband, a man who had endured a lifetime of pain and now sought to speak the truth. In many ways, Meghan became as central to the lawsuit as Harry himself, a silent figure at the heart of the storm. The filing of the lawsuit was the moment when the private pain of a family became a global spectacle. Every detail was dissected, every word analyzed. And as the days stretched into weeks, one question loomed larger than all the rest. What would happen if the case went to court? Could the monarchy survive the sight of a king facing his son across a courtroom, their words and actions ripped apart for the world to judge? The answer was not yet clear, but the consequences were already evident. The lawsuit had escalated the feud to a point of no return. Reconciliation seemed impossible. Trust was gone. What remained was a battle for truth, for legacy, and for survival. And as the dust settled on the initial shock, the world braced itself for the next chapter. The pale, stricken reaction of Prince Harry as he realized just how far his father was willing to go. The moment the lawsuit became public, Harry's world shifted violently. Those close to him described a man stunned into silence, his pale face betraying the storm that raged inside. He had expected resistance, maybe icy statements from the palace, maybe leaks through courtiers trying to discredit him, but never this. A lawsuit was final. A lawsuit was cold. It was no longer about family grievances whispered in private. It was a declaration that his father, the King of England, considered him an enemy whose words had crossed into criminal offense. Harry had always braced himself for rejection, but nothing could prepare him for the feeling of betrayal so sharp it felt like a blade to the chest. The days following the news were a blur of frantic phone calls, hushed conversations, and sleepless nights. Meghan tried to keep him steady, but her own fury made the atmosphere in their Montecito home heavy and tense. She saw it not just as a legal attack, but as a personal assault on their life together, a message from the palace that they would never be allowed to live freely, no matter how far they ran. Harry, however, was torn between rage and heartbreak. Rage at being treated as if his truth were lies. Heartbreak that the man who once tucked him into bed, the father who walked him to school, now sought to punish him in front of the entire world. Friends who spoke with him privately said he kept repeating the same question. How could he do this to me? It wasn't the legal implications that haunted Harry most at first. It was the symbolic reality. A father turning his crown against his son. It felt like exile all over again, only sharper, because this time there was no pretense of reconciliation. The lawsuit made one thing clear. Charles wasn't asking for silence anymore. He was demanding submission. Meghan's anger was volcanic. She reportedly paced their home, calling it proof that the monarchy had never cared about Harry's well-being. She pointed out the irony. Harry had spoken out against what he saw as injustice, and now the monarchy was proving his point by trying to silence him through power and intimidation. But for Harry, Meghan's outrage did little to soften his own shock. He couldn't shake the memories of his childhood, of moments when Charles had seemed distant, detached, prioritizing duty over fatherhood. Now those memories mixed with the present, creating a narrative he could no longer ignore. Perhaps, he thought, this was always how it was destined to end. The media frenzy didn't help. Within hours, headlines plastered his face alongside words like traitor, betrayer, and liar. Every network debated his character. Every paper dissected his motives. Strangers on social media mocked his pale expression, calling it the face of guilt. For Harry, the humiliation was unbearable. He had spent years crafting his identity outside of the monarchy, telling his side of the story in interviews and books. Now all of that seemed reduced to dust, his reputation overshadowed by the image of a son being dragged into court by his father. But humiliation soon gave way to defiance. In private conversations, Harry began to plot his response. If Charles wanted war, Harry would not cower. He confided to friends that he had more to say, more secrets to reveal if the lawsuit went forward. The palace might believe it could bury him, but Harry believed he could burn the palace down with the truth. Whether that was a strategy born of courage or desperation remained unclear, but what was undeniable was the change in his demeanor. The pale shock faded into a hardened resolve. Yet beneath the defiance lay fear. The legal reality was daunting. Defamation suits are complex, and even with the best lawyers, Harry knew the weight of the monarchy gave Charles an advantage he couldn't match. A courtroom battle would drag on for months, maybe years, with every detail of his life scrutinized. Worse still, he feared what evidence the palace might bring forward. Old letters, private conversations, confidential documents. If they were willing to sue, they might also be willing to expose things he never expected them to share. The strain began to show in his marriage as well. Meghan pushed him to fight back harder, to go on television and denounce the lawsuit as an abuse of power. Harry hesitated. He knew that every word he spoke now could become evidence in court. He found himself trapped, silenced in a way he had never felt before. Speaking had gotten him into this mess. Silence, however, felt like surrender. Each night, the arguments with Meghan grew sharper, the frustration spilling over into accusations and tears. The lawsuit wasn't just testing Harry's bond with his father, it was testing his bond with his wife. Behind closed doors, Harry also wrestled with something deeper: guilt. He wondered if he had gone too far, if in his desperation to tell his truth he had inflicted wounds that could never heal. His anger at Charles warred with his longing for reconciliation. Despite everything, he still wanted his father's approval, his love. He wanted to believe that somewhere beneath the crown, there was a man who remembered what it was like to be simply dad. But every time that hope flickered, it was extinguished by the harsh reality of the lawsuit. The king was no longer just his father, he was his adversary. In his most private moments, Harry replayed memories that haunted him. Walking behind Diana's coffin, his father's hand briefly resting on his shoulder. The conversations about duty, about sacrifice, about being strong no matter the pain. Now, those same lessons seemed cruelly twisted. Strength, in Charles's eyes, meant crushing his son to preserve the throne. Duty meant turning love into law. Sacrifice meant Harry would have to give up the last shreds of family he had left. The pale look that the world mocked wasn't just about shock. It was about recognition. Harry finally understood that he had crossed into territory where there was no going back. He was no longer the prodigal son, waiting for forgiveness. He was the outsider, the enemy, the man his own father was willing to destroy to protect the monarchy. The realization was chilling. For the first time, Harry saw himself not as a member of the royal family, but as its target. And so, as the days wore on, Harry's reaction settled into a dangerous blend of fear, anger, and resolve. He would fight, but he knew the cost would be enormous. He would resist, but he knew the odds were stacked against him. Most haunting of all, he knew that this battle would define him forever. No matter the outcome, he would never again be just Harry, Diana's boy, the prince the world once loved. He would be the man who went to war with his father, the king, and perhaps the man history would forever call the traitor prince. The word betrayal carries a special weight inside royal walls. It is not a casual insult. It is a scarlet mark that lingers through history. Families fracture in every walk of life, but when a royal is accused of betrayal, it becomes an event of national and even global consequence. In Harry's case, once the lawsuit was filed, the whispers inside the palace hardened into something colder, something irreversible. He was no longer just the rebellious younger son, the prince who walked away from duty. In the eyes of many within the family, he had crossed into the realm of traitor. The betrayal was not seen as a single act, but a series of choices that painted a clear picture. The Oprah interview had been the first open wound, revealing private family discussions about race and security in a way that blindsided everyone behind palace gates. Then came the Netflix docuseries, where intimate moments and private grievances were broadcast as entertainment for millions. Spare, however, was the deepest cut. It was not just a memoir, but a catalog of accusations, some directed at his father, many at his brother, and perhaps most venomously at Camilla. To expose family arguments is one thing. To accuse the queen consort of manipulation and selfishness was something else entirely. Behind closed doors, William was said to be incandescent with rage. The bond that had once defined the brothers was shattered. To him, Harry had not just revealed private fights, but humiliated him before the world, painting him as violent, cruel, and unsympathetic. For a man preparing to inherit the throne after Charles, image was everything. And Harry had torn his to pieces. William reportedly warned his father that leniency would be seen as weakness. He insisted that Harry had betrayed them all and could no longer be trusted. Camilla's fury was quieter but more dangerous. She had spent decades surviving the hostility of the British press, slowly rehabilitating her image, eventually earning the title of Queen Consort after years of being branded a mistress and a homewrecker. For her, Harry's words threatened to undo all of it. In the private halls of Clarence House, she was said to have urged Charles to act decisively. To her, the lawsuit was not just about defamation, but about reclaiming dignity. Allowing Harry to continue unchecked meant reliving the years of being despised by the public, and this time the hatred would be renewed with royal blood behind it. Even Princess Anne, often considered the no-nonsense sibling who kept herself above the drama, was reportedly blunt. According to insiders, she told Charles that Harry had chosen his path, and if that path led him into conflict with the monarchy, then so be it, and had long been wary of Harry's openness with the press, and now she saw her concerns vindicated. To her, loyalty to the institution came first, even before sympathy for a nephew. The betrayal narrative was further cemented by advisors, courtiers, and the powerful network of palace insiders who exist to protect the crown. They reminded Charles of history. They whispered about Edward VIII, the king who abdicated for love and left his brother George VI to pick up the pieces. They warned that Harry, if left unchecked, could be remembered in the same breath, a modern figure who chose personal grievances over loyalty and tradition. They told Charles that the crown could not afford another betrayal on that scale. But betrayal in this case was not only about Harry turning against his family. To the monarchy, it was also about the potential collapse of the carefully maintained system of secrecy. The Windsors have survived scandal after scandal by keeping family matters sealed behind gilded doors. Harry ripped those doors wide open. That act, in their eyes, was unforgivable. By doing so, he did not only wound his father and brother, he weakened the institution itself. For a family whose very survival depends on mystique and control, this was the gravest betrayal of all. To the public, however, the notion of betrayal was more complicated. Some saw Harry as courageous, daring to expose what he saw as corruption and cruelty. They argued that the real betrayal lay within the palace itself. Betrayal of Diana, betrayal of Harry and Meghan when they sought help, betrayal of the human beings trapped inside an unyielding system. For others, though, Harry's actions were nothing short of treasonous. They saw him cashing in on family secrets, tarnishing the monarchy for profit and applause, betraying not only his father and brother, but the very nation that once adored him. This divide in perception only deepened the pain within the royal household. What might have been handled privately became a matter of global opinion, with millions taking sides. Every headline declaring Harry as a truth-teller stabbed at Charles's authority. Every headline calling him a traitor stabbed at Harry's identity. The family betrayal was not confined to palace walls. It was broadcast, analyzed, and judged on the world stage. What made it all more tragic was the unspoken presence of Diana. Her memory loomed over every argument, every accusation, every moment of silence. Harry believed he was honoring her legacy, standing up against the institution that he felt destroyed her. Charles and William, however, believed Harry was dishonoring her by dragging the family deeper into chaos. To them, Diana's name should be a unifying force, not a weapon. But in Harry's hands, it became part of the battleground, another layer in the story of betrayal. As the lawsuit loomed, betrayal became the word that defined Harry's place in the family. The king's lawsuit wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making an example of betrayal itself. It was a warning to every member of the family, present and future. Loyalty is not optional, and betrayal has consequences. Harry, meanwhile, sat oceans away, wrestling with what betrayal meant to him. Was he betraying his family? Or was he betrayed first by a family that refused to protect him and Meghan from relentless attacks? Was he the traitor, or was he the victim of a monarchy that demanded silence while allowing cruelty? In the echo of those questions lay the real tragedy. Betrayal is never one-sided. It is a mirror reflecting back pain from both directions. And now, that mirror was shattered, leaving sharp edges that cut everyone involved. The family betrayal had reached its peak. What came next was inevitable. With the bonds of love and loyalty broken, the only stage left was the one no royal ever wants to face, the court of law, with the world watching every move. The moment the lawsuit hit the public domain, the world's media descended like vultures on fresh prey. For decades, the royal family had been a favorite subject of tabloids and broadcasters, but this was different. This was unprecedented. A king suing his son for defamation wasn't just news. It was history being written in real time. Cameras camped outside Buckingham Palace. Reporters staked out Harry and Meghan's Montecito home, and columnists churned out endless takes about betrayal, loyalty, and the possible collapse of the monarchy's image. What had once been whispered in royal corridors was now shouted on every television screen and splashed across every headline in the world. In the UK, the tabloids went into overdrive. They seized on every angle, painting Harry as the reckless spare who had finally crossed a line so thick it could never be erased. Photos of him looking pale and withdrawn were printed with captions that mocked him as the face of guilt. Some papers revived the nickname Traitor Prince, suggesting that his actions were worse than Edward VIII's abdication, because Edward had walked away quietly, while Harry had chosen to torch the house on his way out. Columnists wrote with venom, accusing him of selling out his family for Hollywood dollars, of weaponizing Diana's legacy, of dragging the monarchy through the mud simply to satisfy his ego. For the tabloid press, Harry was no longer just controversial. He was radioactive. Across the Atlantic, the American press was more divided. In the United States, where Harry and Meghan had built their new lives, sympathy was more easily found. Some networks portrayed the lawsuit as evidence of a monarchy out of touch with modern values, punishing a son for daring to speak his truth. Talk show hosts debated whether Charles was abusing his power. Was this a king defending his reputation, or a father silencing his child? The contrast in coverage highlighted the deeper cultural divide. In Britain, the monarchy was still seen as a national symbol worth protecting. In America, it was increasingly seen as an outdated relic struggling to contain its own scandals. Social media turned the entire affair into a 24-hour circus. Hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag Traitor Prince, hashtag Justice for Harry, hashtag King vs. Son. Memes flooded Twitter and Instagram, some mocking Charles as a ruthless monarch wielding his crown as a weapon, others mocking Harry as a hypocrite who claimed to want privacy, yet aired his grievances to the world. TikTok creators dissected clips of Harry's interviews, splicing them with dramatic music to highlight contradictions. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed the lawsuit was a smokescreen to hide deeper royal secrets. Others argued it was part of a plan to exile Harry permanently. The court of public opinion was louder than any courtroom, and in that space, Harry and Charles became characters in a global drama too captivating for people to ignore. The media circus also amplified every division within the royal family. Reporters camped outside Kensington Palace, eager to capture any glimpse of William and Kate, parsing their expressions for signs of support or condemnation. When William made a speech at a charity event, headlines screamed that his tone was a subtle dig at Harry, even if his words never mentioned his brother. Camilla's public appearances were scrutinized with equal intensity, her every smile dissected to determine whether she was secretly gloating or carefully masking her fury. Even Princess, and usually untouched by tabloid speculation, was pulled into the fray, her stoic silence painted as either disapproval of Harry or quiet solidarity with Charles. For the monarchy, the media circus was both a weapon and a curse. On one hand, the frenzy made Harry look more isolated, more vulnerable. On the other, it drew fresh attention to every accusation he had ever made. Every time the lawsuit was mentioned, his claims about neglect, racism, and manipulation were repeated, ensuring they remained alive in the public consciousness. The lawsuit meant to silence him paradoxically gave his words new life. What made this moment especially volatile was timing. Charles had only recently been crowned, the first new king in 70 years. His reign was supposed to symbolize continuity, duty, and healing after the turbulence of Elizabeth's passing. Instead, it was defined by scandal, with the king and his son tearing each other apart in full view of the world. The coronation celebrations now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the bitter image of a family at war. For a monarchy that thrives on pageantry and stability, the optics were disastrous. News channels treated the lawsuit like a blockbuster trial before it even began. Legal experts filled panels, explaining defamation law to audiences who had never cared about it before. Some argued the king's case was strong, pointing to passages in Harry's memoir that could be framed as false statements presented as fact. Others suggested it would be nearly impossible for Charles to win without opening the monarchy to unprecedented scrutiny. Every broadcast ended with the same chilling question: could the king's lawsuit backfire and destroy the very institution it sought to protect? Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan found themselves besieged by paparazzi in California, their sanctuary once again invaded. Photographers stalked them at restaurants, followed them to charity events, and even circled their home with drones. Every photo of Harry looking weary or stressed was sold for thousands of dollars. Meghan, dressed in designer clothes, was accused of enjoying the attention even as she claimed to resent it. The couple's every move became fodder for speculation, feeding the cycle of coverage that made their lives feel like a never-ending public trial. What made the media circus unbearable for Harry was not just the coverage, but the framing. He had always believed he was fighting for truth, exposing the cruelty of the monarchy to free himself and his family. Now, headlines branded him a traitor. Talk shows mocked his sincerity. Opinion writers portrayed him as a man consumed by bitterness, willing to destroy his father for profit. He found himself trapped in the same cycle that had destroyed his mother: chased, mocked, vilified. Only this time, it wasn't just the press against him. It was his own father leading the charge. Through all of this, one truth became clear: the lawsuit was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had become a public spectacle, a theater of betrayal and power where every citizen of the world was invited to play jury. And in that theater, the monarchy risked becoming less a symbol of tradition and more a soap opera consumed by scandal. The circus was only just beginning. Court dates would be set, legal teams prepared their strategies, and the public braced itself for revelations that could shake the institution to its core. But in this moment, one fact stood above all others. The lawsuit had already achieved something irreversible. It had turned a private wound into a global spectacle, ensuring that even if the court one day fell silent, the echo of betrayal and spectacle would ring on for generations. The moment King Charles's legal team confirmed that the case would proceed, a new kind of tension began to grip both sides of the Atlantic. The lawsuit was no longer just a symbolic gesture or a palace threat whispered behind closed doors. It was real, and it was heading toward a courtroom. The image of a reigning king dragging his own son into a legal battle was staggering enough. But the deeper implication, that centuries of royal mystique could be dragged under the harsh fluorescent lights of a courtroom, was even more devastating. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations took on the tone of a military operation. The king's advisors, many of whom had been through decades of scandal management, realized that this was not simply about winning a legal case. It was about survival of the crown's credibility. Lawyers sifted through Harry's memoir, every transcript of his interviews, every public statement he had made since stepping down from royal duties. The lawsuit hinged on specifics: which words could be proven false, which accusations were reckless, which claims were damaging enough to the monarchy's reputation to merit defamation. But the lawyers also knew that the case could not simply be argued like any other. Every word uttered in court would be dissected by the press, replayed on global news, and weaponized by both sides of the public divide. The palace's strategy was twofold. First, they would present the king not as a vengeful father, but as a head of state forced to defend the institution. The lawsuit was not about silencing Harry, they insisted, but about protecting the monarchy's integrity. Second, they would aim to demonstrate a pattern of exaggeration and misrepresentation in Harry's words, painting him as unreliable, inconsistent, and driven by personal vendettas rather than truth. If successful, this would not only win the lawsuit, but destroy Harry's credibility in the eyes of the world. Across the ocean in Montecito, the mood was just as tense, but far more personal. Harry's legal team faced a daunting challenge. They knew that the king's lawsuit was not simply about what was true or false, but about power. How does one fight against the most entrenched institution in Britain, an institution with centuries of influence, wealth, and control of the narrative? Their defense would have to be bold, framing Harry not as a reckless traitor, but as a victim silenced by a system that had ignored his suffering. The stakes were not only Harry's reputation, but his freedom, should damages or punitive measures escalate to criminal allegations tied to perjury or obstruction. The legal preparations became entangled with public relations. Meghan pushed for a strategy that involved Harry speaking out more, reminding the world of why he had chosen to reveal what he did. Harry's advisors, however, warned him to stay silent, fearing that any misstep in interviews could be used against him in court. For Harry, it felt like a trap. For years, he had fought to have his voice heard. Now, silence seemed to be his only option. The man who had built his identity around speaking truth was suddenly being told that the best way to survive was to say nothing. Meanwhile, speculation about what a courtroom showdown would look like fueled endless media coverage. Would the king himself appear in court, or would his lawyers represent him while he maintained royal dignity at a distance? Would Harry take the stand, forced to defend his words under oath? Could Camilla be dragged into the proceedings, her reputation dissected once again before the eyes of the world? The questions were endless, and each one added a new layer of intrigue to the unfolding drama. What unsettled both sides most was the unpredictability of the trial. A courtroom is not like a palace, where secrets can be managed and scandals suppressed. If the case proceeded fully, evidence would have to be presented. That meant documents, communications, perhaps even testimony from insiders. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but it had always done so on its own terms. In court, those terms no longer applied. For the first time in centuries, the monarchy could be placed under oath. The very idea sent chills through those sworn to protect the institution. The brewing courtroom battle also ignited debates in Parliament and among constitutional scholars. Some questioned whether it was appropriate for the king to sue his son at all, given his role as head of state. Others argued that Charles had no choice, that allowing Harry's accusations to stand unchallenged would erode the monarchy's authority permanently. What was clear was that the lawsuit had moved beyond family drama. It had become a constitutional crisis in the making. For the public, the looming trial was irresistible. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, hoping for glimpses of reactions. Television networks promised wall-to-wall coverage when hearings began. Some called it the trial of the century, a courtroom showdown that would rival the most famous scandals in history. To many, it was Shakespearean tragedy unfolding in real time. A father and a son, once bound by love and blood, now enemies in a public arena that promised no mercy. Harry himself grew increasingly restless. Those close to him said he often walked the halls of his home at night, unable to sleep, replaying in his mind the things he had written and said. Would the court see them as truth or as reckless attacks? Would the jury or judge sympathize with his pain or condemn him as a man who bit the hand that raised him? The uncertainty ate at him. He had chosen to tell his story, but in the harsh light of legal scrutiny, stories could be twisted into lies, and truths could be lost in the shadows of technicalities. The phrase courtroom drama brewing took on a life of its own. This was not yet the trial, but the anticipation, the speculation, the build-up that created an atmosphere of dread and fascination. Each side armed itself with documents, witnesses, and strategies, while the world waited to see whether reconciliation would be abandoned forever in the pursuit of legal victory. And so, the stage was set. The king and the spare, bound by blood but divided by law, prepared to face one another not across a palace table, but in the stark, unforgiving setting of a courtroom. The drama was brewing, unstoppable, and it promised revelations and consequences neither side could fully control. Every lawsuit carries the risk of discovery, the legal process where each side must present evidence, documents, and testimony to support their claims. But in this case, discovery meant something far more dangerous. It meant the monarchy's carefully guarded secrets might be dragged into the public eye, dissected under oath, and broadcast to a world eager for scandal. The very thought of it made the palace shudder. For centuries, the House of Windsor had thrived on control of image, control of narrative, control of truth itself. But now that control was slipping. And as Harry's team prepared its defense, whispers began to surface that evidence existed which could devastate the royal family if it ever saw the light of day. The earliest hints came from leaks to the press. Journalists who seemed unusually well-informed reported that Harry's legal team was compiling a list of internal communications, letters, text messages, and even audio recordings. Some were said to be between Harry and his father, others between palace aides and the press. If true, these could support Harry's long-standing claim that the palace had fed him and Meghan to the wolves, trading negative stories about them in exchange for protection of more senior royals. For Harry, these secrets were not simply weapons. They were proof that his suffering was real, that his accusations were not born of paranoia, but of betrayal. But the threat went both ways. Palace insiders hinted that Charles's team was prepared to unseal its own arsenal. Rumors swirled of private correspondence where Harry expressed bitterness and jealousy long before Meghan entered his life. Messages that painted him as unstable, erratic, even vindictive. Others spoke of financial documents showing just how much the monarchy had supported him and Meghan even after their departure. Evidence, they claimed, that contradicted his public narrative of being cut off. The possibility of these revelations being presented in court sent shockwaves through the family. The brewing courtroom battle also ignited debates in Parliament and among constitutional scholars. Some questioned whether it was appropriate for the king to sue his son at all, given his role as head of state. Others argued that Charles had no choice, that allowing Harry's accusations to stand unchallenged would erode the monarchy's authority permanently. What was clear was that the lawsuit had moved beyond family drama. It had become a constitutional crisis in the making. For the public, the looming trial was irresistible. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, hoping for glimpses of reactions. Television networks promised wall-to-wall coverage when hearings began. Some called it the trial of the century, a courtroom showdown that would rival the most famous scandals in history. To many, it was Shakespearean tragedy unfolding in real time. A father and a son, once bound by love and blood, now enemies in a public arena that promised no mercy. Harry himself grew increasingly restless. Those close to him said he often walked the halls of his home at night, unable to sleep, replaying in his mind the things he had written and said. Would the court see them as truth or as reckless attacks? Would the jury or judge sympathize with his pain or condemn him as a man who bit the hand that raised him? The uncertainty ate at him. He had chosen to tell his story, but in the harsh light of legal scrutiny, stories could be twisted into lies, and truths could be lost in the shadows of technicalities. The phrase courtroom drama brewing took on a life of its own. This was not yet the trial, but the anticipation, the speculation, the build-up that created an atmosphere of dread and fascination. Each side armed itself with documents, witnesses, and strategies, while the world waited to see whether reconciliation would be abandoned forever in the pursuit of legal victory. And so, the stage was set. The king and the spare, bound by blood but divided by law, prepared to face one another not across a palace table, but in the stark, unforgiving setting of a courtroom. The drama was brewing, unstoppable, and it promised revelations and consequences neither side could fully control. Every lawsuit carries the risk of discovery, the legal process where each side must present evidence, documents, and testimony to support their claims. But in this case, discovery meant something far more dangerous. It meant the monarchy's carefully guarded secrets might be dragged into the public eye, dissected under oath, and broadcast to a world eager for scandal. The very thought of it made the palace shudder. For centuries, the House of Windsor had thrived on control of image, control of narrative, control of truth itself. But now that control was slipping. And as Harry's team prepared its defense, whispers began to surface that evidence existed which could devastate the royal family if it ever saw the light of day. The earliest hints came from leaks to the press. Journalists who seemed unusually well-informed reported that Harry's legal team was compiling a list of internal communications, letters, text messages, and even audio recordings. Some were said to be between Harry and his father, others between palace aides and the press. If true, these could support Harry's long-standing claim that the palace had fed him and Meghan to the wolves, trading negative stories about them in exchange for protection of more senior royals. For Harry, these secrets were not simply weapons. They were proof that his suffering was real, that his accusations were not born of paranoia, but of betrayal. But the threat went both ways. Palace insiders hinted that Charles's team was prepared to unseal its own arsenal. Rumors swirled of private correspondence where Harry expressed bitterness and jealousy long before Meghan entered his life. messages that painted him as unstable, erratic, even vindictive. Others spoke of financial documents showing just how much the monarchy had supported him and Meghan even after their departure. Evidence, they claimed, that contradicted his public narrative of being cut off. The possibility of these revelations being presented in court sent shockwaves through the family. Friends of Harry and Meghan found themselves pulled into the drama. Subpoenas were rumored to be in the works. Former aides who had signed non-disclosure agreements faced the terrifying possibility of being forced to testify under oath. Already, anonymous sources told reporters that they were being pressured by both sides. Harry's team seeking allies, the palace seeking silence. Each revelation threatened to blow open years of palace secrecy. For the public, the idea of secrets exposed was irresistible. Every day, new speculation filled the airwaves. What if emails proved Charles had authorized negative press against Meghan? What if recordings captured conversations that contradicted the monarchy's official stance? What if evidence emerged of financial arrangements meant to keep Harry silent? The possibilities read like the plot of a political thriller, but this was no fiction. These were real questions with real consequences. Harry himself wrestled with the burden of what to reveal. On one hand, exposing palace secrets could vindicate him, proving that he had been smeared, manipulated, and abandoned. On the other hand, it meant burning any bridge that might remain between him and his family. The palace would never forgive such revelations. Worse, the public might grow weary of his constant disclosures, seeing him not as a truth-teller, but as a man obsessed with revenge. He confided to friends that the choice felt impossible: protect his father and risk losing the case, or win the case and destroy his family forever. Meanwhile, Charles faced his own dilemma. To sue his son was already controversial. To allow palace secrets into the public domain could be catastrophic. Advisors urged him to consider settlement, to find a way to end the case before discovery reached its peak. But Charles was stubborn. He believed that yielding now would make him look weak, and weakness was fatal for a king so newly crowned. He was determined to push forward, even if it meant exposing truths that had been buried for decades. As the weeks wore on, leaks grew more specific. A major newspaper reported that Harry's team had evidence of a coordinated smear campaign against Meghan, involving palace staff briefing journalists with negative stories in exchange for favorable coverage of William and Kate. Another outlet hinted at private letters from Charles to Harry during the height of the Meghan controversy, letters that showed a father more calculating than compassionate. These reports were never confirmed, but they fueled public appetite for more. The circus grew louder when talk began of Diana's legacy being pulled into the case. Some speculated that old correspondence from her, preserved in archives or in Harry's possession, might resurface as evidence. If Diana's words were introduced in court, they could frame the narrative in devastating terms, reviving memories of how the monarchy treated her and raising painful questions about whether history was repeating itself with her youngest son. The specter of Diana loomed larger with each passing day, her name invoked in headlines, her image splashed across magazine covers once more. The build-up toward trial felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. Everyone knew that if the case went forward, secrets would not just be hinted at, they would be laid bare. And once exposed, there would be no way to put them back into the shadows. The monarchy could lose more in discovery than it could ever win in damages. Harry, too, risked losing whatever sympathy remained if the revelations were seen as too cruel, too invasive, too destructive. The chapter of Secrets Exposed was not about what had already been revealed, but about the unbearable tension of what might still come. The monarchy, an institution built on centuries of mystique, stood on the brink of being stripped bare in a courtroom. And Harry, the boy who had once walked behind his mother's coffin, now carried in his hands the power to either shatter the monarchy forever or be shattered himself in the attempt. When the lawsuit became international news, the glare of the spotlight did not fall only on Harry. Meghan, as always, found herself pulled into the center of the storm, whether she wished it or not. For critics, she was the hidden architect of Harry's rebellion, the woman who lured him away from duty and loyalty. For supporters, she was the strong partner who gave Harry the courage to speak his truth against an institution that had consumed his mother. The truth, as ever, was far more complicated, But in the media circus surrounding the case, nuance had no place. Meghan was cast in stark, unforgiving terms: villain or heroine, manipulator or liberator, traitor's wife or brave truth-teller. From the moment she married Harry, Meghan had been treated as an outsider by the British press. Her race, her nationality, her Hollywood background, all had been used to portray her as someone who could never truly belong. Now, as the lawsuit threatened to drag Harry into court, those same narratives returned with greater venom. Headlines accused her of pushing Harry too far, of encouraging him to attack his family for profit. Commentators framed her as the mastermind, whispering in Harry's ear and pulling him further from reconciliation with his father. The lawsuit may have been filed against Harry, but Meghan was the ghost at the heart of every accusation. The palace narrative reinforced this perception. Anonymous briefings suggested that Harry, left to his own instincts, might have stayed quiet. It was Meghan, they implied, who insisted on speaking out, who pushed for interviews and documentaries, who encouraged him to write Spare. These claims, whether true or not, stuck. They painted Meghan as the instigator, the reason why Charles had felt compelled to take the drastic step of suing his own son. In public perception, Meghan's presence amplified the sense of betrayal. She wasn't just Harry's wife, she was the wedge that had split father and son beyond repair. But to Meghan's supporters, this portrayal was deeply unfair. They saw her as a woman vilified from the start, forced to endure relentless attacks, while the palace failed to protect her. They argued that Meghan had every right to defend herself and her husband, that speaking out was not manipulation but survival. For them, the lawsuit was not proof of Meghan's meddling but proof of the monarchy's cruelty. It was yet another attempt to silence a woman who had refused to bow to tradition. Inside the Montecito home, Meghan's anger grew alongside the scrutiny. To her, the lawsuit confirmed everything she had believed about the monarchy, that it valued image over people, that it was willing to crush its own members to preserve power, that it cared more about headlines than humanity. Friends who spoke with her privately said she encouraged Harry to see the lawsuit not as a personal attack, but as a systemic one. It was the institution, she argued, not just his father. It was the same institution that had hounded Diana, ignored their pleas for help, and left them to fend for themselves against the press. To Meghan, the lawsuit was not surprising, it was inevitable. Yet the scrutiny weighed heavily on her. Paparazzi chased her with renewed energy, hoping to capture a look of triumph or fear. Fashion magazines analyzed her every outfit, reading symbolism into colors and styles. If she wore black, it was grief for the broken family. If she wore white, it was arrogance. If she smiled, it was mockery. If she looked serious, it was guilt. There was no escape from interpretation. Meghan's every gesture became part of the narrative, proof to one side or the other that their view of her was correct. What made the spotlight especially cruel was how it revived old wounds. Meghan had once confessed that palace life drove her to the brink of despair, that the constant scrutiny nearly cost her her life. Now, years later, the cycle had returned with greater force. The lawsuit meant that the world was once again dissecting her role, her motives, her character. The burden was immense, not only because of what it meant for her personally, but because she feared its impact on Harry. She knew how fragile he could be under pressure, how memories of Diana's death still haunted him. To watch him pale and collapse under the weight of his father's lawsuit was unbearable. And yet, she also knew they had no choice but to stand firm. Retreat was no longer possible. Public opinion hardened in extremes. Supporters rallied around Meghan, praising her for her resilience, calling her a victim of both the monarchy and a racist press. Hashtags like #StandWithMeghan trended, accompanied by messages from women who saw her as a symbol of survival against oppressive systems. Critics, however, unleashed vitriol. They accused her of destroying Harry's life, of dragging him into conflict he might have avoided, of using him as a pawn for fame and fortune. In the battle for perception, Meghan was both shield and target, her image weaponized by both sides. In Britain, the palace did little to protect her. That silence was interpreted as tacit approval of the hostility directed at her. Courtiers believed any defense of Meghan would further inflame tensions with Harry, while some saw her vilification as convenient, shifting public anger away from Charles and onto her. The strategy may have worked politically, but it deepened the rift on a human level. To Harry and Meghan, the silence was proof that the palace had abandoned them completely. As the trial loomed, Meghan faced the very real possibility of being called to testify. Lawyers debated whether her involvement in interviews in the Netflix series made her a central figure in the case. The thought of Meghan on the witness stand electrified the media. Would she break down under questioning? Would she reveal private conversations with the royal family? Would she turn the courtroom into a stage for the grievances she had long carried? The mere speculation was enough to dominate headlines, further entrenching Meghan in the heart of the storm. For Meghan, the prospect of testifying was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it would mean exposing herself to the kind of hostility that once nearly destroyed her. Liberating because it might finally give her a chance to speak without filters, without palace aides controlling the narrative, without the press twisting her words. In private, she admitted to friends that if she had to take the stand, she would not hold back. The palace, she said, had underestimated her resolve. And so Meghan remained in the spotlight, unwillingly yet unavoidably. Every move she made, every word she spoke, carried disproportionate weight. She was cast as both scapegoat and warrior, both manipulator and victim. The lawsuit might have been Harry's to fight, but Meghan was inseparable from it, her image and her voice woven into the very fabric of the case.